I keep coming back to the grandmother, not Melody. Melody was the face of it, the one I saw, the one I spoke to, the one whose photograph I kept on my phone for 8 months. But the face is not the thing. The thing behind the face is what I cannot stop thinking about. An old woman in Iloilo who had identified me as a target before I had any idea she existed, who had positioned her own granddaughter as the mechanism, who had managed the entire operation from a house I never visited with a patience and a precision that I find even now, even after everything genuinely remarkable, not admirable, remarkable. There is a difference, and I'm old enough to know it. My name is Stanley Pemberton, 75 years old. I spent my working life in property development, in Manchester commercial, residential, regeneration projects across the north of England. I built things, literally and figuratively, and when I retired in 2017, I was comfortable in the financial sense and somewhat adrift in every other sense that matters. My second marriage had ended in 2015. My children from my first marriage had their own lives in their own cities, and the house in Didsbury where I had lived for 20 years was exactly the right size for a man with a full life and exactly the wrong size for a man whose full life had recently become less full. I took up golf badly, traveled adequately, and spent 2 years doing the things retired men do when they are waiting to find out what they actually want to do. In 2019, I went to the Philippines for the first time, recommended by my solicitor Derek, who had been there twice and said it was more interesting than it looked on a map. Derek was right, as he usually is about most things except his own golf swing. I went to Cebu first, then to Iloilo, which is a smaller city on Panay Island that Derek had mentioned as undervisited and worth the extra travel. I spent 10 days there and liked it more than I expected, calmer than Cebu, cleaner in the way of a city that has not yet decided to compete with the larger ones, with a particular quality of afternoon light over the waterfront that I photographed badly every day and still remember clearly. I came back to Iloilo in 2020 for 3 weeks, and in 2021, I signed a 6-month lease on a small apartment near the Esplanade, because it was cheaper than my Didsbury house and considerably warmer, and the pace of it was doing something useful for what I can only describe as the accumulated tiredness of a long career. I met Melody Santiago in February of 2021. She was a primary school teacher at a school near the city center, 29 years old, Ilongga, and she had the particular quality of someone whose work requires them to be genuinely present with other people and who has therefore become genuinely present with other people as a matter of character. She was not sophisticated in the urban professional sense that I had been accustomed to. She was warm and direct, and she asked questions that showed she was actually listening to the answers. I met her through a community English conversation group that a British expat named Colin had organized, a weekly gathering where locals who wanted to practice conversational English met with English-speaking residents. I had attended twice as a way of meeting people outside the expat bubble. Melody had been attending for a year. We talked for about an hour at that second gathering. She asked about Manchester, not what she had heard about it, but what I thought of it, what I missed about it, what I did not miss. Nobody had asked me that question in a way that made me think they wanted a real answer, and I gave her one. I told her I missed the directness of Northern English people, the specific humor that comes from a place that has had difficult enough times to develop a sense of proportion about everything. She said, "That sounds like Ilonggos." I asked what she meant. She said people from Iloilo were known among Filipinos for their gentleness, but that gentle and soft were different things, and that Ilonggos had a backbone that the gentleness sat on top of. I found that observation interesting and told her so. She smiled and said, "My Lola says the same thing about herself." Lola, I had learned by then, was Tagalog and Hiligaynon for grandmother. I noted the reference and moved on. I wish, now, that I had noted it differently. Melody and I saw each other 6 more times over the following 3 weeks, twice at the conversation group and 4 times for coffee or a meal. The progression was natural and easy, not charged in any dramatic way. She was not flirtatious and I was not pursuing anything in particular. What I was doing, without quite naming it, was enjoying the company of a person whose attention felt genuine and allowing that enjoyment to become a regular part of my week. By March, I was looking forward to seeing her in the specific and quiet way that you look forward to things you have decided are good without making a declaration about it. In April, she mentioned her grandmother for the second time. We were having dinner near the waterfront when she said, "My Lola would like to meet you." I asked why. She says any man I spend this much time with is worth knowing. I asked whether she had been telling her grandmother about our time together, and she said yes, that she told her Lola most things, that her grandmother had raised her from the age of 7 after her parents separated, and that the relationship between them was the closest she had. She said it simply, without performing the sentiment, and the simplicity of it made it feel real. I said I would be glad to meet her. We arranged it for the following Sunday. I want to describe that first meeting with Concordia Santiago carefully, because it is the meeting I have gone back to most often in the 2 years since I understood what she was. She was 78 years old, small, with the upright posture of a woman who has maintained physical discipline as a matter of pride. She spoke English well, better than I had expected, with a formal quality that suggested she had learned it from books and church rather than conversation. She received me in the front room of a small, well-kept house in a residential neighborhood of Iloilo City, offered me tea, and spoke to me for nearly 2 hours. She asked about my career with specific and intelligent questions. She understood property development, she said, because her late husband had worked in local construction for 30 years. She asked about my family with the careful interest of someone who is making an assessment rather than making conversation. She asked about my health, my plans for the Philippines, my views on the city and its future. And through all of it, she was warm and gracious, and she treated me with the particular respect that an older woman gives an older man when she has decided that the context requires it. I drove back to my apartment that evening thinking she was a remarkable woman. I used that word remarkable to myself, in my own head, and I want to note that because it is the same word I used at the beginning of this account to describe her operation. I saw the quality correctly from the beginning. I simply misidentified what it was attached to. Melody and I became closer through April and May. The time we spent together had shifted slightly more personal, more honest, the kind of conversations that happen when two people have spent enough time in each other's company that the public-facing version of themselves has been allowed to relax a little. She told me about her parents' separation in a way that was factual and clear-eyed, without self-pity, but also without the false resolution that people sometimes perform when they want to appear healed from something. She said her grandmother had been everything: mother, father, financial provider, moral authority. She said, "Everything I know about how to be a person, she taught me. I heard that as love and loyalty. I hear it differently now." The first money request came in June, not from Melody, from Concordia. I received a text message from an unknown number that I later understood was Concordia's asking whether I might be available to come by the house on Saturday. When I arrived, Melody was not there. Concordia made tea and sat across from me and said, without any preliminary, that the family had a situation. A neighbor had filed a land boundary dispute regarding a small portion of the property the Santiago family had occupied for 40 years. The legal process required documentation, retrieval, and a retaining fee for a solicitor. The amount needed was £8,000. She said she was telling me because Melody was too proud to ask for help, and because she, Concordia, was not too proud, and because she believed I was someone who understood that real support sometimes required practical form. I gave her the £8,000. I want to say that without softening. I gave her the money on a Saturday afternoon after a 40-minute conversation, without consulting anyone, without asking to see the legal documents she referenced, without taking any time to think about whether this was the kind of thing I should be doing. I gave it because Concordia had asked in a way that made refusing feel like a statement about the seriousness of my regard for Melody, and I was not ready to make that statement. I gave it also because £8,000 was not a sum that required deliberation from a man of my financial position, which is exactly the calculation that had been made about me before I walked through that door. The requests that followed over the next 18 months had the same architecture initiated by Concordia rather than Melody, framed as practical needs rather than personal asks, sized at amounts that were significant but not alarming for a man of my means. and always preceded by a period of warm, undemanding time with Melody that built the emotional context in which saying no to a grandmother's practical request would have felt like a withdrawal of something larger. The land dispute resolution cost a further £12,000. A medical situation involving Concordia's own health required £22,000 across 2 episodes. Melody's classroom renovation, the school had no budget, and Melody had apparently been paying for supplies herself for years, required £18,000. A younger sibling's university fees required £15,000 per year across 2 years. A flooding event at the house required £25,000 in repair and replacement costs. A family debt from Concordia's late husband's construction work, apparently still owed to a supplier, required £35,000 to settle before the family could proceed with a property registration that was being held pending resolution. Each of these came separately. Each had its own story, its own timeline, its own documentation when I asked for it, and I did begin asking for documentation after the 4th or 5th request, which produced documents that appeared legitimate and that I accepted without independent verification. Each transfer was followed by a period of warmth and closeness with Melody that made the money feel less like a transaction and more like the cost of something I valued, and Melody herself never asked for a thing. That is what I understood last, and it is the thing that most precisely reveals the sophistication of the operation. Melody had been positioned as the relationship while Concordia managed the extraction, which meant that the person I was giving money to was not the person I was emotionally connected to, and my emotional response to Melody was therefore never directly contaminated by the financial demands. Every time Concordia asked for something and I gave it, I went back to Melody and felt the warmth of a relationship that had not asked anything of me. That separation of the emotional relationship from the financial one was the engineering. It was the most important structural decision in the whole design. I told my son Nicholas about Melody in August of 2021. Nicholas lives in Leeds, works in financial services, and has his mother's habit of asking questions in a sequence that only reveals its purpose at the end of the sequence. He asked how we had met, how long I had known her, what she did, how old she was. He did not react visibly to any of the answers. Then he said, "Dad, what does her family think of you?" I told him about Concordia, about the warmth of the household, about the various ways the family had allowed me into their world. He said, "Have you given them any money?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I told him about the land dispute and the medical costs and the classroom renovation. He said, "How much total?" I told him approximately £75,000 at that point. He was quiet. Then he said, "Dad, I'm going to ask you to do something, and I need you to actually do it. I need you to stop all transfers to anyone in that family until you've had an independent solicitor in Iloilo verify the situations they've described." I said I would look into it. He said, "I need you to actually do it, not look into it." I said I would. I did not. I told myself I would and I did not, and the reason I did not is the same reason I have repeated throughout this account in different forms. Acting on Nicholas's advice would have required me to treat the situation as suspicious, and treating the situation as suspicious would have changed how I was present with Melody, and I was not willing to change how I was present with Melody because being present with Melody was, by that point, the most consistently good thing in my daily life. The total reached £175,000 by December of 2021. By June of 2022, it was £240,000. In September of 2022, a single request of £35,000 came for what Concordia described as a final consolidation of the family's outstanding obligations, a payment that would, she said, clear the remaining debts and allow the family to begin building stability rather than managing crisis. She said, "After this, Stanley, I can promise you there will be no more needs of this kind." I have written earlier about a similar promise made in a different story and noted that such promises function as closure mechanisms. They allow the giver to frame the final transfer as a defined end rather than a continuation of an undefined series. I was not reading that other story. I was sitting in Concordia's front room hearing a promise from a woman I had trusted for 18 months and I transferred £35,000 the following week. The total was then £275,000. The further £25,000 came across 4 smaller amounts between October and December of 2022, each with its own small explanation, each preceded by Concordia's assurance in September that there would be no more. By January of 2023, the total was £300,000. The discovery came sideways, the way the most important information usually comes. In February of 2023, I had coffee with an Australian man named Philip who had been in Iloilo for 4 years and who had, over the previous months, become a genuine friend in the way that shared geography and similar ages produce genuine friendships. Philip was direct in the way of Australian men and had a habit of saying things simply that others would dress up, which I had always appreciated. He asked me over coffee how things were going with Melody. I told him well. He said, "Is her grandmother still involved?" Something in the phrasing of that question was different enough from how he usually spoke that I paid attention to it. I asked him what he meant by still. He looked at me carefully and then said, "Stanley, I should have said something sooner and I didn't because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to damage something that might have been real. But I know of 2 other men in this city who have had relationships with women from Iloilo that involve significant money going to an older female relative of the woman. In one of those cases, the older relative was described as a grandmother. I don't know if there's a connection. I might be completely wrong, but I want you to know what I know." I drove home from that coffee with a feeling I did not have a name for yet. It was not panic. It was something more deliberate, the beginning of an investigation that I had been avoiding conducting for 18 months and that I now understood I could not avoid any longer. I spent that evening doing what I should have done in June of 2021. I attempted to verify, independently, the legal situations that had been the basis of the major transfers. I contacted the Register of Land Disputes for the relevant barangay and asked about the boundary case Concordia had described. The clerk I reached could find no record of any such case involving the Santiago family property. I contacted the hospital Concordia had named during the medical episodes and asked about patient records for the dates she had given me. The records office could not confirm any admission under the name she had provided without proper documentation, and my informal inquiry produced nothing verifiable. I looked up the property registration process that had been pending the supplier debt resolution and found that the specific type of registration she had described did not require the kind of third-party debt clearance she had presented as the obstacle. One by one, the stories began to fail under the pressure of independent inquiry that I had refused to apply for 18 months. I went to Concordia's house 2 days later. I did not tell Melody I was going. I knocked on the door and Concordia answered and looked at me with an expression that was, and I have thought about this expression many times since, not surprised. She stepped back to let me in, which was the gesture of a woman who had been waiting for this visit and had decided to receive it with dignity rather than avoid it. She sat. I sat. I told her what I had found, the land registry, the hospital, the property process. She did not immediately deny any of it. She was quiet for a long time, the longest pause I had experienced in her company in 2 years of knowing her. Then she said, "You are a man who has done well in his life, Stanley, and you are alone in a way that men like you often are. I did not invent that loneliness. I simply knew how to address it in a way that served my family. I told her she had taken £300,000 from me under false pretenses. She said, 'You gave it willingly.' I told her willingness depended on information and that the information she had given me was false. She said, 'Some of it was false, some of it was real.' The money for the classroom, Melody genuinely needed that. The flood damage that was real. I asked which parts were false. She looked at me and said, 'The parts that were largest.' I'm not going to pretend that conversation was not the most disorienting 40 minutes of my adult life. Not because of what she admitted the admission was, in a cold way, a relief after the uncertainty of the previous 48 hours, but because of how she admitted it. She did not apologize. She did not perform remorse. She explained, with the clarity of a woman who had thought carefully about her position for a long time, that she had identified me as someone with resources who was building an emotional connection in her city, that she had assessed the connection as one that could bear financial weight, and that she had managed the extraction in a way designed to preserve the connection as long as possible so that the weight could be applied gradually rather than all at once. She spoke about it the way a developer speaks about a project, with the language of method and outcome and managed risk. I recognized the vocabulary because I had used it myself for 30 years. She had been running an operation with the same structural logic as a development project, and the product she was selling was the experience of being needed by a family in a place far from home. I asked her about Melody. She said Melody knew, not the details. She said Melody had not known the specific amounts or the specific fabrications, but Melody had understood from the beginning that I was a man her grandmother had identified as someone who could help the family, and that her role was to be the person I was helped toward. She said, "Melody is a good girl. She was not cruel to you. The feelings she showed you were not entirely false. But she knew what the arrangement was." I asked whether Melody had feelings for me in any real sense. Concordia said, "She was fond of you. But fond is not the same as what you thought it was." I told her that was not an answer. She said, "It is the only honest one I have." I left Concordia's house and sat in my car for a long time. I did not call Nicholas. I did not call Philip. I did not do anything for about an hour except sit in a car on a residential street in Iloilo City and process the particular grief of a man who has understood that the entire emotional context of 2 years of his life was, if not false, then something substantially different from what he believed it to be. Not the feelings themselves, those were real. They happened. I felt them. But the ground they stood on, Melody had been warm with me in ways that felt genuine and may have been genuine in some proportion that I cannot now determine, but she had also been positioned. She had known what the arrangement was. She had allowed me to believe something about the nature of our connection that she knew was not fully true, and she had done it not through active deception but through the complicit performance of a role that her grandmother had designed for her. That is a more complicated thing than a lie. It is harder to be angry about and harder to recover from, because you cannot locate it cleanly as betrayal when the person who perpetrated it was herself, in some sense, also inside a structure she had not designed. I spoke to a Philippine attorney in Iloilo, found through the British consulate's assistance list, independent of anyone connected to the Santiago family, who reviewed the situation and told me, as Rosario had told Quincy Mansfield in a different city and a different story, that the voluntary nature of most of the transfers made civil recovery difficult. She said an estafa claim was theoretically viable, but that proving the fraudulent intent behind each transfer would require documentation of the fabrications that I had not collected contemporaneously. She said the strongest element of a case would be the land registry discrepancy, which was demonstrable from official records. She filed a preliminary complaint and we discussed the timeline, which was long, and the likely outcome, which was uncertain. I authorized her to proceed and paid her retainer and drove home to the apartment I had been renting for 2 years. Nicholas flew out in March. He did not say "I told you so," which cost him something, and I am grateful for the restraint. He spent a week helping me organize the documentation, working through the chronology of transfers and the evidence of fabrication, building the record that the attorney needed. He was methodical and thorough, and he worked alongside me without commentary on how the situation had come to be, which is how a good son helps a father who has made an expensive mistake by attending to what can be fixed rather than what cannot. On his last evening in Iloilo, we had dinner at the same waterfront restaurant where Melody and I had eaten many times, and he said, "Are you going to be all right?" I told him I did not know yet. He said, "I mean in general, not just the money." I told him, yes. I believed it when I said it, which is something. I have thought at length about Concordia Santiago, who she is, what she has done, how long she has been doing it. Philip, after I told him the full story, made some quiet inquiries through his own network in Iloilo and came back to me 3 weeks later with information that confirmed my worst suspicion. He had found, through a Filipino contact who moved in community circles, that the name Concordia Santiago was known in certain conversations as someone who had facilitated similar arrangements involving foreign men on at least 2 previous occasions. The arrangements had not all been identical, different granddaughters, different family members, different amounts, but the structural pattern was the same. An older woman, a younger female relative, a foreign man with resources and some form of emotional availability, a gradual financial extraction managed at the family level, while the romantic dimension was maintained at the individual level. She had been doing this for years. She was probably doing it with other men while she was doing it with me. That thought the image of a 78-year-old woman in a well-kept house running parallel operations on multiple foreign men, managing the extraction timelines, coordinating the storylines, training the granddaughters, is the thought that produces in me something I can only call a kind of appalled admiration, which is not the same as respect, but it is an acknowledgement that what she was doing required considerable intelligence and considerable discipline, and those qualities do not stop being what they are because of how they were applied. I left Iloilo in April of 2023. Not because I could not remain. The apartment lease still had months remaining and the legal process was ongoing and the attorney could manage it without my physical presence. I left because I had been in Iloilo long enough to know its streets and its waterfront and its particular quality of afternoon light, and all of those things had become attached to a period of my life that I needed to put behind me without erasing. I could not stay in the place and simultaneously move past what had happened there. I went back to Manchester. I stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks while I decided whether I wanted to return to the Didsbury house, and then I went back to the Didsbury house and sat in it for a month and understood that it was still too large for one person and too small for the grief of 2 years of complicated feeling. And then I rang my daughter Claire in Edinburgh and told her I was coming to visit and stayed for 3 weeks, and it was the best 3 weeks I had spent in 2 years. The legal case is ongoing. The attorney has filed the complaint, and the process moves at the pace of Philippine administrative justice, which is measured in years rather than months. I have no expectation of recovering the majority of the £300,000. I have enough that the loss does not threaten my stability, which I am aware is a form of fortune. What I do not have, and will not recover, is the 2 years of experience that were built on a foundation that was not fully real. I can say the feelings were real. The conversations were real. The afternoons on the waterfront were real. But the framework in which all of that occurred, the grandmother's design, Melody's positioned role, the architecture of managed intimacy and extracted resource was not what I understood it to be. And the specific loss of those 2 years is not financial but experiential, which is a kind that does not have a legal remedy. I will say this, which is the most practical thing I can offer to anyone who reads this account and finds themselves in a situation with any structural resemblance to it. The grandmother was not visible to me for a very long time. The operation worked because she stayed behind the relationship, while the relationship did the work of building my trust and my emotional investment. The way to have seen her earlier would have been to pay attention not to the warmth of the individual relationship but to the pattern of what flowed from it, to ask, from the beginning, who benefits, who requests, who manages the money, and whether the person I am emotionally connected to and the person making the financial demands are always one step apart. They were, in my case, one step apart throughout. Melody never asked, Concordia always asked. That distance was the design. And the design would have been visible earlier if I had been looking for it rather than allowing the warmth of what I had with Melody to occupy all of my attention. I was not looking for it because I did not want to be the kind of man who looked for it. That preference, the preference for trust over scrutiny, for warmth over verification, is not a flaw exactly. But it is an opening, and there are people in the world who have learned to build operations precisely fitted to that opening. Concordia Santiago was one of them. At 78 years old, she had been doing it long enough to be very good at it. At 75, I had been doing other things long enough to be exactly the kind of man she was good at finding. That is the whole of it. I am home in Manchester. The house is still too large. The afternoons here have a different quality of light.